right, if you have your Bible, let's go ahead and be opening to Acts chapter 20 is where we will begin tonight. We started this morning looking at the order of the church, the authority and government of the church, how it is supposed to be run according to the New Testament. And we talked about the need to associate, or to probably in a lot of cases reassociate, some images that we have with the word authority. And so authority carries with it the notion, as it is in the biblical sense, first of all, that it is delegated. No human being is inherently authoritative. The authority that they carry has been delegated to them by God, and therefore they will answer for their use of that authority. And the second thing is that authority is not being in a position to set up and dictate. Authority is putting on a towel and getting down and serving people and washing their feet as Jesus did. And so we spend some time just kind of walking through. I'm just I'm a simplistic person. I have to try to break things down into their flows and into, as you can see, I mean, it's nothing really complicated about what we talked about this morning, but sometimes it's important that we understand what's going on and that ultimately our authority comes from God, and understanding how to wield that authority and how God has ordered it within the church setting itself. So tonight, we're going to review a little bit of some of the departures that took place. And this is not something, by the way, sometimes I think when we talk about some of these subjects, people think, oh, well, you're talking about a Church of Christ thing. Like this is something y'all think happened. Listen, the sources that I research for church history are not Church of Christ resources. It is church history, okay? It's not a matter of affiliations to certain groups. It's a matter of historical fact, okay? And so there was a progression that was modeled and of departure that things went differently. And I will tell you that the departures we're going to look at were well-intentioned and easy to make. And they don't happen immediately. It kind of happens over time. And then we'll spend some time talking about the three, and we mentioned them this morning, the three models by which most churches are going to govern themselves. And just kind of put that in front of us so we can have that before us. So first of all, as we think about the departure from this pattern, so there was this prediction when the Apostle Paul was with the Ephesian elders that there would be a problem within that eldership. So in Acts 20, verse 28, he has called them to Miletus to meet with them. And verse 28 we know very well. Pay careful attention to yourselves and to all the flock in which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers to care for the church of God, which he obtained with his own blood. For I know that after my departure, fierce wolves will come in among you, not sparing the flock. And from among your own selves will arise men speaking twisted things to draw away the disciples after them. Therefore be alert, remembering that for 3 days I did not cease night or day to admonish everyone with tears. And now I commend you to God and to the word of his grace, which is able to build you up and give you the inheritance among all those who are sanctified. And so as he talks about the problem that would arise within the Ephesian church, which you remember, that when Paul wrote Timothy, well, both letters, but especially the first letter, he had left him in Ephesus to help him, for him to do some things to help the church there. And for a long time, it kind of puzzled me why 1 Timothy 3 was in there with the qualifications of elders and deacons, because one of the things we know with a rock-solid fact is that when Timothy went to Ephesus, they already had elders and deacons. So why does he go through the process of rehashing all this? And the most common answer that people give, that I've heard people give to me when I ask that question was, well, that's because God wanted them recorded. Yeah, but if he wanted them recorded, there's a million other ways to do that. That doesn't make sense. So why does he choose to put them here? Why is he doing it in 1 Timothy? I mean, he already was going to have them recorded in Titus 1 because Titus's express mission was to help establish elderships in local churches. The only thing I can put together is based on Paul's last speech. He said there are going to come in wolves among you. That is, they're going to come from the outside and come from the inside. And then he says from your own selves. Now, who is he talking to? the Ephesian eldership. From among your own selves, some people are going to arise. There will be people come in from the outside, but there are also going to be people on the very inside of that group who are going to do some things that can damage the church. And based upon the contents of 1 Timothy, when you look at the bookends of it in chapter 1 and chapter 6, it looks like that's already happening. And that's not far removed from this particular meeting. So, this is something that has been predicted. The New Testament talks about this falling away that's going to take place. And in other places, like 2 Thessalonians, it will speak of it very clearly. So, Paul is here already predicting there's going to be some issues in these congregations as they develop. Now, when we deal with these things, as we talked about this morning, we don't want to be overly simplistic, okay? We don't want to speak with wide, sweeping generalities. And you've heard the phrase, history does not happen in a vacuum. Some people try and treat it like it's an isolated incident, right? For an example, the American Revolution that took place. The notion that many people have is that the American Revolution was supported by a majority of Americans when it happened. Except it wasn't. It was actually divided into thirds. A third said yes, a third said no, and a third said, we just want to be left alone. So, things aren't as simplistic sometimes as we can treat them. So, I want to explore two of the paths. These are not the only ones. These are two of them that took place. So, the first path has to do with how they dealt with false teachings. Okay? So, obviously, during the era of inspired men, you had an inspired man who could give you a direct message from God about how to handle certain situations. But as those men start dying off, then we're left with, okay, how do we handle the controversies? Well, in the first couple of centuries, many of the controversies didn't really rage that strongly because they were facing persecution here and there. And so, but as time went on and as Christianity became more popular and more accepted, more controversies began to creep in. And so what they would do is they would come together and they would hold councils to discuss how they should handle the issue at hand. For an example, one of the most infamous of the councils is the Council of Nicaea in 325. Okay? It was what is called the Arian controversy. Arius was a man who taught some things about the nature of Jesus that were completely inconsistent with what the New Testament said. And so church leaders came together to discuss and to issue a statement about their assessment of what was going on. And to be honest with you, when you look at it, I don't see how what they did was wrong. There's nothing wrong with church leaders coming together, discussing an issue that's before them, and even issuing a statement that says, we don't agree with what he's saying. But the danger that can come, and you can see the inherent danger, and this is what would eventually happen, is that then councils would be convened for all types of things, and what they said began to be treated. The councils would issue the creed, and then the creed would be treated at the same level of Scripture. So, if you study ministry or Bibles of any kind at a university level, you're going to have to take systematic theology, which is, well, anyway. And one of the things that you will see when you read people's systematic theology is just the basic 7 cardinal doctrines of Christianity, okay? And of course, the first doctrine that you study in that is the doctrine of God. And what you will read ad nauseum, and I do mean ad nauseum, is so-and-so is not faithful to the Nicene Creed. With all respect, the Nicene Creed doesn't determine what is orthodox and what is true about the nature of God. Does that creed, does their assessment of the situation hold value? Yes, I believe it does hold value to look at the controversies and the studies that they had. But to treat it As if that is the standard by which you judge the faithfulness of an individual, it illustrates that a creed has been elevated to a level that it does not belong. Okay? The final assessment and authority for us is God, not the Council of Nicaea in AD 325. So when you deal with councils and creeds, some people look at them and say they're absolutely worthless. I can't agree with the assessment that they're absolutely worthless. I can agree with the assessment that they are not authoritative. They don't have a bearing that says I should believe it because they said it. Okay? But so that was where this first path kind of started. Okay? And you can see how this is going to spill over into church leadership issues, because if you have a council of leaders getting together to discuss something, churches and congregations have to ask themselves a question, which is what? It's very practical. Who are we going to send? Who are we going to send to contribute to this discussion? Right? Why this person? Okay? Why then are we moving? You can see how you can start to elevate this person. Okay? Now, the second path is literally like the first path. Such a good intentioned thing. And I think that the people who originally sat on the Council of Nicaea would actually be very upset if they saw what people were using their studies to do. I really do. I think they would be upset by it. But then you get into another issue, and you get into the second area. So, here's what happened. As we saw, and this is something straight across the board, there is a series of books that is still being produced where it will say, well, on this one, it's like 5 views on church government. And one person that holds to that conviction of that view will write a chapter explaining their perspective. And they put all 5 of those there together so you can read and survey the evidence. And it's almost any subject you can think of, they've got them. It's a very good way to see a full view of what's going on. So, but here's one thing that all 5 of those views in this particular book agreed upon, and that is that in the first century, what they can read about in the Bible, there were only ever elders, and elders in plurality, that were over local churches. That is I'm not going to say universally in the sense that every single person, because that's never going to happen. But if you stack the numbers, it's like 90-10 agreement, okay? That's where things started. So, a number of people who are members of the church have never been to an elders meeting. Well, I've sat through a few. And so, this is kind of what happens in an elders meeting, and it makes sense. One elder each month, it's rotated. You kind of decide you're going to be responsible for gathering in the information, leading the discussion, and making sure, and going around and discussing things. All right? Say you've got 5 elders. What if one of them proves to be really efficient? Like can really do an excellent job at getting things done and moving forward? What is the tendency that takes place? You give it to the guy who's the most efficient, and he just becomes the guy who's now responsible for this all the time. Would you believe that that's actually how all this confusion about church government began? That's how it started. You had one guy who then they would elevate him, and they would call him by different names, but they would call him the presiding elder. So it started out where you had elders and deacons and members, and then it became, but you've got the guy who's the presiding elder, and then the other elders and the deacons and the members. Then, as time progressed forward, they changed that presiding elder to someone who was a bishop. They had a bishop that then took over and oversaw multiple congregations. Okay? So you had a bishop that was kind of over multiple groups, a presiding elder that was kind of over one, that was kind of over a congregation, and then the elders serving with him, and then the deacons, and then the members. Now, how did all the bishop stuff start? Well, actually, like many things, well-intentioned. It was congregations that were located near each other. They said, how can we collaborate and work together to spread the gospel? I don't see why that's a bad idea. I see that exactly doing what Jesus said. But you run into the same problem, right? You've got a guy who's super efficient. We need somebody who can kind of oversee the whole data hub and the information. And what happens? It becomes a position. Then it moved into, you had archbishops. So the archbishop usually came from he was a bishop over usually a big city. So you had 5 major cities in early Christianity. You had Jerusalem, Antioch, Constantinople, which of course today is Istanbul. You had Rome and Alexandria. Those were your major cities. And so the men who served as bishops over those cities, well, they must be more talented and more gifted, right? Because they're overseeing larger groups. They've got better experience. So we start investing more authority in them and entrusting them and overseeing more groups. And that's where you get to archbishops. So you have an archbishop who is over a bishop, and he's over regions. So, for an example, you would have an archbishop over Jerusalem and Antioch and Constantinople and Rome and Alexandria and the cities that had been assigned to that. Well, then, and this is a process, okay? This is the mid to late 100s on up until you finally get in 606, you've got Pope Boniface III, who is the first kind of universally recognized. There was one before him, but there were some issues there. So you've got Boniface III who sits as Pope. And ex cathedra and all these infallibility and a lot of different ideas that develop out of this. So when we look at what is happening, I want to be cautious of us developing this image. Because sometimes when people present this information, they present it with an image that there were these really evil people that wanted to take control. That's not an accurate image, okay? Do I agree with what they did and how that? No. Okay? I don't agree with their end game. But to paint them as people who were simply trying to overthrow what God had put in place, it's a little bit hard for me to swallow. Okay? So, that led into that particular system, okay, where you have, which is technically characterized under what we'll see in just a moment, the Episcopal system. Okay? And then when the Reformation comes along, 1517, October 31st, 1517 is usually the date associated to the Protestant Reformation because that's the day that Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg, except he didn't nail them. He actually probably glued them. That's how they did that. But the myth sounds a lot better if he just hammers a nail in a church, in a cathedral door. Well, they just didn't do that. So, and a lot of people, Luther is illustrated as this guy who was trying to overthrow the Catholic Church. That was not Luther's intention. Luther was himself a Catholic priest. He put these 95 Theses on the door to talk. He wanted there to be debate within the Catholic Church so that these things could be reformed and changed. Okay? And because they refused to reform and change and even come to the table and have a real discussion about things, because by the time of his life, things had gotten, the men who were popes were as crooked as a dog's hind leg, as my dad used to say. Okay? They were crooked, and there's no arguing that. All right? So, then you would have the development of a different type of system. Okay? So, that leads us then here with the three basic ideas and governments that exist today. The first one is what we mentioned a moment ago. It's the Episcopal model. So, as we mentioned this morning, there are three particular Greek terms used in the New Testament to describe what we call the office of elders. We get 6 names from those 3 terms and 6 descriptions of what their jobs are from those 3 terms. So, this one comes from actually a term for elders, episkopos, okay? So, the episcopal view. Episkopos, epi is a Greek prefix that means over, and then you have skopos, to scope something, to see it. So you're looking out over something, okay? And so this is where you have, this is the term used to describe, translate in the New Testament, bishop or overseer. And so the basic structure goes something like this. And by the way, this is not something that's going to be universal. Whenever I talk about information like this, I am somewhat nervous because I don't want somebody walking out going, hey, I know how your church is organized. No, you don't. Okay? In theory, this is the model that they operate from. To say and assume that's what every one of them do, don't do that. Okay? Because that's not how this works. Okay? Any more than I wouldn't want somebody going into a church, certain churches of Christ and say, oh, that's how the churches of Christ are. No. We don't do that. Okay? So, we're dealing with rough models and structures. Okay? So, in this Episcopal approach, you have an archbishop. Okay? You don't have a pope per se in the sense that you do in the Catholic version, although the Catholic Church is an example of an Episcopal type church model. So you have the archbishop, you've got the bishop of the diocese that's over that particular region, you've got the rectors, which are the priests in the local churches and their deacons, and then their parishes. So the minister or the priest, they kind of have authority over the local church to oversee those things, and basically the members of those churches have zero say in their properties, and many times they don't even own their own properties. They're actually owned by the denomination itself. Which is why, by the way, you're seeing some things that you're seeing in the news. Okay? So when a denomination splits, and that denomination owns the property, you got to decide who's going to get it. Right? So, that's why a number of churches, even in our own community, are having to decide and having to vote whether they want to stay with, because in this particular instance, the group that won out was a group that did not stay true to what the Bible said concerning some of the most fundamental elements of humanity. Well, but now they're the ones who own the property, and so churches, local congregations now have to buy back their property from the denomination if they choose to leave their fellowship. Many of their preachers have their retirement funds, pensions, set up through that denomination, so they're having to decide, am I going to forfeit my pension, or am I going to go and continue to do and state what the Bible has said on this particular subject? So, these are some things that we run into, but the members basically have no say over the ministers. They have no say over the church property. Many times ministers are routinely shuffled, okay? And certain ministers in some of these models don't even actually write their sermons. They are mailed to them by the denomination, and then they get up and they preach them, okay? So that's the Episcopal model. For an example, Eastern Orthodox churches, Anglican Church, Church of England, the Episcopal Church, which is the American form of the Anglican Church, also falls under this category, and the Roman Catholic Church as well. Okay? Then we come to the Presbyterian model. So when we talk about the Presbyterian Church, it's actually based on a structure model. It's not like there was some dude named presbyter. It comes from the Greek term presbyter. Okay? And so when we're dealing with this is the word translated presbyter in the New Testament or elder in the New Testament. And so in this particular model, it's a little bit different. So you have the congregation itself, and then there are a session of elders that are above them. And then they answer to the presbytery, which answers then to the general assembly. Okay? So churches, local churches, are governed by a board of elders called a presbytery. Okay? They install ministers, and they can exclude local churches from their fellowship. And they also have a court of appeals to where you can offer complaints and do different things, and a number of different things that are going on. For an example, obviously the Presbyterian Church, whether that's Cumberland Presbyterian or run-of-the-mill Presbyterian, many years ago there was a big break between more conservative Presbyterian churches and more liberal Presbyterian churches. That's where Princeton Theological... So all of our... Not all, I can't say that because I don't know that for a fact. A great portion of our Ivy League schools were schools of theology to begin with. Okay? Princeton being a prime example. Even up to the early 20th century, Princeton was considered the premier theological conservative seminary in the world. They broke and went with the more liberal side of things. So those churches are involved with that. Then you come to the congregational model, okay? And this is more, so in the previous two, in the Episcopal and the Presbyterian model, the members don't really have a say on really who's preaching to them. They don't own their properties many times, so a lot of different things are with that. The congregational model is named the congregational model for this reason. The congregation is involved with things. And so this is where you get into what we talk about quite a bit in church autonomy. Okay? Now here is a common misconception. So the largest Protestant denomination in America is the Southern Baptist Convention. Okay? But the Southern Baptist Convention, they can do certain things, but churches are not answerable to the SBC. That is a common misconception. People believe that the SBC controls local churches. They do not. It is on a voluntary basis. Baptist churches, the majority of Baptist churches follow a congregational model. They may participate in the Southern Baptist Convention, but they are congregational in the sense they own their properties, they control their leaders, they control who fills their pulpits, and the SBC cannot touch that, they cannot influence that, there's nothing they can do. They can throw a fit, but they're not going to get their way. So, when we deal with this particular model, there is emphasized in here church autonomy. Okay? Autonomy comes from two Greek terms that are put together, basically. So you've got autos, which is self, and nomos, which is law. So a self-law, a self-governing institution. Okay? One of the things in churches of Christ that we are very adamant about is that churches be autonomous. We don't have the right to walk to a church, another congregation in our town, and say, you have to do it this way. We don't get that right. They are their own self-governing body. People say, well, what if they get things wrong? Then just as we have to, they will have to answer to God for whatever it is they've done the same way we will. But we are autonomous. So then, underneath this setting, there are two approaches that we mentioned this morning. You have a single elder church and a plural elder church. So in single elder-led churches, and this is what not all but many, for an example, Baptist churches are led this way, where you have a single elder or a pastor-led system. Okay? Now, look for just a moment at Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 11. Because some people will often ask, here's one thing I want to emphasize to you. I don't have the time to go into all the details of it. Here's one thing I want to emphasize to you. Don't accuse other people of just making things up for why they do things. because they have biblical reasons. Now, whether I agree with their biblical rationale is a different story. But the majority of people are not out here saying, I just want to do what I want to do, and if you don't like it. There are reasons behind it. Okay? So, how do they get to pastoral-led system? Well, Ephesians 4 and verse 11 says, and he gave the apostles and the prophets and the evangelists and the shepherds and teachers. Well, the term translated shepherd here is poimen, which is also translated pastor in other places. And pastor is one of the words that describes elders. And in certain manuscripts of the New Testament, the term here translated shepherds and teachers is actually combined by a hyphen, which would make them translate pastor-teacher, which is where they get the notion then that the pastor is the one who is overseeing the local church. There may be a board of deacons, there may be lay elders to which they are somewhat responsible, but that's their job. They are pastor-teachers. And furthermore, when you look at the books of 1 Timothy and Titus, what do you find Paul doing on both of those occasions? Paul is dispatching a preacher to local churches, and especially Titus. What is he dispatching him to do? Titus 1 and verse 5. For this cause I left you in Crete, that you might ordain elders in every city. So what do you have there? You have a preacher being sent to ordain elders. And it seems like he's the one who's making that decision on his own. Do you see where they're coming from? Are we starting to see? Again, I cannot emphasize it strongly enough. When we sit, if we try and sit in an ivory tower like we're the only ones that's got the Bible figured out and we're the only ones that look at the Bible, we are sadly mistaken. There are people that do things because they have studied the same Bible, they have come to different conclusions. Whether you agree with their conclusions, there's nothing we can do about that. And I'm not even saying that the conclusions of certain things are correct. I am saying treat people with respect. Treat people with respect. So, you have a single elder-led system. Now, one of the issues with the single elder-led system, which is why we adhere to a plural elder-led system, is because throughout the New Testament, especially when you go through Acts and you read statements concerning elders and you look for your Greek terms, not just English terms, but for your Greek terms, that it is elders who have responsibilities to oversee the local church. There are occasions when you look at Titus, one of the things you need to keep in mind when you look at Titus and what he is doing is you have an inspired apostle looking at another inspired man saying, these are new churches and you need to go help them figure out. One of the gifts of the Spirit was to be able to discern spirits, to look on the hearts of people. Okay? He's telling him to go and to help them get ordered. That's far different than saying that's something that should be done in practice as the norm all throughout the New Testament, when the majority of the New Testament paints a very different picture, when you have qualifications that are meant to be met in 1 Timothy chapter 3 of being married and having children and a host of other qualifications. And those individuals, for an example, when Paul writes to the church at Philippi, he writes to them and he addresses them to the bishops or the overseers and the deacons and the members at Philippi. There's not a preacher's not mentioned, a pastor's not mentioned, because pastor, I believe, is captured in the term overseer. Because the three terms are used interchangeably throughout Acts 20, 17 through 32, and 1 Peter 5, 1 through 4. Okay? So, people say, that was really boring. Well, sorry. It is what it is. And we need to be able to discuss with an amount of intelligence what is going on in the world. And again, reiterate the fact that no one has ever been mocked or spoken down to out of believing something that was wrong. So, a lot of other things could be said if you want to do some more research on it. I've got some things you can look at if you want to. But we come back to the main premise of why God designed authority and how he put it in place. And it's not red tape and paperwork and appeals. It is people directly on the ground, elders in local churches being directly involved with the lives of the people, helping them and making decisions and serving them. When you look at the New Testament, that's the way. And even people who adhere to other forms of church government, all of them will agree that that's the way it was when you open up your Bible. And so it's about being a place, the church is about being a place where authority is understood to be given by God, and thus we are responsible for how we use it, and we're supposed to use it to serve people, even those with whom we disagree. So tonight, as we sing this song in just a moment, we're inviting people into the church, a place where people will, invest in one another, care for one another, look after one another, and not wield our authority in the sense of lording it over God's flock, 1 Peter chapter 5. And so if a person is willing with penitent faith to confess Christ and to be immersed in water for the forgiveness of their sins, they become a part of that. Or maybe we're struggling with something else. This is an opportunity, of course not the only one, but an opportunity for us to pray together. And if we can help you do that, we want to as we stand and sing this song.